Thank you, Nathan. My name is Aaron Hager. I'm the Extension Weed Scientist in the Department of Crop Sciences here at the University of Illinois. And I thought it would be a good reminder to brush up a little bit on some of the early season weed species that we may be seeing in fields at this particular point of the season, as well as some considerations around one of those species trying to get it under control before planting. So no big surprise if you've been around the countryside, many of the fields are beginning to green up fairly rapidly. Or as you can see in the background of this particular slide, I guess you could say that many of these fields are beginning to color up with several species of winter annuals predominantly. Now, some of the more common winter annual species that we see would include the following. You could advance the next slide, please. Common chickweed is very common throughout many areas of the Midwest. It's typically a fairly low growing species, and it typically will produce a very small white flower. At very, very dense stands of common chickweed, it does a very, very good job of actually shading the soil surface, which can delay soil drying, as well as the warming effects from the sun. One of the other species that we see commonly around the state, if we could go to the next slide, is henbit. And henbit is actually a member of the mint family. And one easy characteristic to identify henbit as well as another mint would be the square stem. And typically henbit we see across many areas of the central and northern portion of Illinois. Right now it's beginning, it's actually started its flowering cycle, and as you can see toward the top of this particular photograph, it has these very small reddish to pinkish colored flowers. The other mint that we do see in many areas of Illinois is called purple dead nettle, and also has a square stem just like henbit, whereas the upper leaves of henbit tend to be described as sessile, or actually wrapping around the upper portion of the stem. The upper leaves of purple dead nettle are actually attached by what's called a petiole. So again, another way to distinguish between these two. We typically find more purple dead nettle as we go a little farther south in the state, whereas again, henbit is predominantly here in the central and the northern portion of our state. Another species that we deal with is actually one of the mustard species that we have. Actually, we have several different species of mustard in Illinois, but this is field pennycrest, and perhaps one of the more common ones that we see. I did take a little walk yesterday afternoon across the field and noticed that many of the field pennycrest are also now beginning to flower. And it'll produce a white flower with 4 distinctive petals that are in the shape of a cross. Another one of our mustard species that we have in Illinois is yellow rocket. And as the name aptly describes, this is a mustard species that when it flowers will produce very yellow, bright, showy flowers. Again, 4 petals that actually are in the form of a cross. Now, one other species that people often mistake for yellow rocket for obvious reasons, because it has these very bright, shiny yellow flowers, is called crestleaf groundsel, otherwise known as butterweed. And this actually is not a mustard, it's actually a member of the aster plant family. And it's the one that in about another month to month and a half, if we're not able to get these under control, actually makes a lot of people think that we're actually growing a lot of canola here in the state of Illinois, because it'll grow up to about maybe 2-3 feet tall. And again, under very dense stands, it looks like the entire field has a very deep yellow cast to it. Now, there's a lot of important reasons and considerations to control existing vegetation before we put any seed in the ground. And as we mentioned a little bit earlier around common chickweed, if we're able to adequately control the winter annual vegetation, that allows the soils to warm faster as well as dry faster when it's not underneath this very dense mat of vegetation. As Dr. Sider could attest, that a lot of times green fields are favored positions for certain insects, such as the black cutworm moth, to deposit eggs. And if those fields happen to be going into corn, we could see some elevated populations of black cutworm. And then also some species of winter annuals actually serve as what we call a green bridge, and for a very important soil pathogen of soybean, and that's the soybean cyst nematode. And so the earlier that we can get all of these species under control, the better off that we will be throughout the growing season. there's always the inclination of some to want to put seed in the ground first with the idea that they could come back at a later point in time and try to control this existing stand of winter annual vegetation. Many times that can work successfully for them, but that also comes with a lot of risk and challenges. Always the best laid plans that we have for trying to control weeds through chemical usage are pretty much predicated by the weather, and we simply cannot have any control over the weather. So while we may think we can come in and make an application of a burn down type product to control these dense stands of winter annuals, it's all going to be dependent upon when the weather will allow us to do that. So again, always advisable to control any of this existing stand ahead of planting. Obviously, tillage with something like a tandem disc, a field cultivator, or some combination of those two can be effective in controlling any of the existing vegetation. Generally speaking, the smaller the vegetation is, the more effective a one-pass tillage operation can be. But as many folks realized after the 2019 growing season, sometimes as these populations gain size, if we're unable to control them, a one pass with a tillage operation may not be sufficient in terms of getting these under control. And of course, the other option would be some combination of a burn down herbicide. We have many, many effective products that could be used specifically to control the existing vegetation, as well as many that have more soil residual activity that also could give us some burn down on this vegetation. One of the last ones that we did want to mention would be horseweed or mare's tail. Predominantly in Illinois, in the northern portion of the state, horseweed or mare's tail still exists as a winter annual. And so by its biology, it's going to germinate sometime in the fall, overwinter, and then resume growth in the growing season. And we mentioned mare's tail specifically because we see more and more instances across the state now of what you can see in the next slide, and that is burn down applications that simply are not effective in controlling the mare's tail when the burn down application relies predominantly on glyphosate. Many of our populations of mare's tail or horseweed in Illinois are actually glyphosate resistant. And so in a burn down consideration, we need to think of alternative products that could give us more assistance on mare's tail than what we can realize with glyphosate by itself. So some of the general considerations for pre-plant control of mare's tail in the spring, number one would be a one-shot, what we call a one-shot burn down application. And for something like mare's tail, earlier is always going to be better than later. So here we sit now in the early part of April, but conditions on a day like today, for example, we have bright sunshine, warm air temperatures, would actually be a fairly good day to get good activity on things such as mare's tail and our other winter annual species. However, because of the biology of mare's tail and the known resistance issues, we can expect more variability in burn down efficacy in this one-shot approach, especially as the plants get larger as we progress throughout the early part of the spring. Split burn down applications can also work in the spring. Ideally, we'd like to talk about split applications where a fall application timing would be the first, but however, obviously that has now passed. So if you think about what could we do for split burn downs in the spring, it could be something, for example, at this point in the calendar right now where we have the burn down predominantly targeting the winter annual vegetation, including the mare's tail, perhaps even a low rate of a residual product. So one possible example would be a combination of 2,4-D plus a glyphosate plus somewhere around 4 to 8 ounces of a dry metribuzin. Or you could alternatively use something else fairly effective on mare's tail, like the saflufenicil type products. But then come back with another burn down if needed closer to planting time, and then put on the remaining of the residual during that particular application. Now, in some portions of Illinois, we also see mare's tail exhibiting a life cycle that's more similar to a summer annual. And so we not only need to control the winter annual populations prior to planting, but give some thought to residual herbicides that could give us some in-season control of any of the spring or summer emerging mare's tail. And on the next slide, we've got a few of these products listed, one other option to control mare's tail in a burn down scenario would be a product like dicamba. And what we're looking at here are some data that we generated several years ago, looking at the efficacy of dicamba compared with a common burn down tank mix of glyphosate 2,4-D. This population was resistant to glyphosate, so really the half pound of 2,4-D was the only effective product in that tank mix. But when you compare the efficacy at either 2 weeks or 30 days after application, we can see that any rate of the dicamba containing products gave us much greater control of mare's tail compared with just the glyphosate 2,4-D. And if we can go down to our next slide, this is just simply a list of some active ingredients, predominantly in soybean, that can give us some residual control of mare's tail. So active ingredients such as products containing sulfentrazone or flumioxazin or metribuzin, generally speaking, can give us several decent, good weeks of residual mare's tail control in the spring of the year. And the last thing, and I don't have a slide for this, but there's been a lot of talk and a lot of tweets about early planting soybean, which certainly a lot of people are trying this practice out. One thing just to mention about early planted soybean at this time on the calendar, if you're planting dicamba resistant soybean in particular, the label allows dicamba applications up to 45 days after planting. So at 46 days after planting, we can no longer make foliar application of dicamba in soybean. And looking at the calendar for any dicamba soybeans that are planted today, and this would be April 8th, 45 days from today is May 23rd, which means we still have a great portion of the growing season in front of us, dealing with and contending with some of the summer annual species such as the amaranthus species, water hemp, palmer amaranth, that have the ability to germinate and emerge much later into the season. So if we are going that route with early planting on dicamba soybean, we would suggest that folks give some consideration of how can they extend the residual control after that 45-day window for foliar applied dicamba. So with that, I think I'm done, and we'll turn it over to our next speaker, Dr. Gary Schnitke.